All right.
Hi.
Hi. Despite this mess with technology, here we all are. I'm so happy. Good time zone, everyone. This is the Decolonizing Our Narrative Traditions panel. I am your moderator, Vita Cruz, she, her. I'm a writer and editor of SFF, and I keep talking about decolonizing in Flights of Foundry for some reason, so I guess that's why I'm moderating this talk. Okay, and I'll call on my fellow panelists, and you'll introduce yourselves, your pronouns, and anything you would like to promote. Mia first.
Hey, I'm Mia Tsai, she, her. I am an author and editor. My debut novel drops next March from Tachyon Publications. It's called Bitter Medicine. Maybe it's a little decolonial. I think that's like the most relevant info for right now.
Fatima.
Yes, so hi, I'm Fatma Takvi, she, her, and I'm a Pakistani writer of speculative fiction generally, though I do write other stuff, but mostly SFF. And I've had a few works published, like in Strange Horizons, Flash Fiction Online, in this new magazine which publishes South Asian writers. It's called Tasavvur magazine. So yeah, and I have something upcoming in Fantasy magazine. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
Excellent. Zweining.
I'm Zuining. I'm a Malaysian editor, writer, and book reviewer, usually based in the UK. I usually write spec fic with like an interest in history, climate, and post-colonialism. My probably most decolonial project at the moment is a theatre project, time travel, called Asian Pirate Musical, which is exactly what it says on the tin.
My God, I'm excited now. All right, and Agana Chope.
My name is Ogenechowe Donald Ekpeki. I'm an African speculative fiction writer and editor in Nigeria. I've edited a number of publications, the Dominion Anthology, the year's best African speculative fiction anthology, and the Africa Reason Anthology, forthcoming on Tor.com in November. My works have appeared in Asimov, Strange Horizons, and a bunch of other magazines. So, yeah.
Okay. Sometimes my audio cuts out, so I'm not sure if I've missed something or whatever, but I think
Okay.
the intros are done. Sorry. Okay, let's get to it then. Our first question this panel is, well, it's not a question, but please tell us briefly about your favorite narrative structure or your narrative structure of expertise. Zoining?
Okay, me first. I'm gonna briefly tell you a bit, like half and half, about some the East Asian 4-act structure, which is known as Gisho Denketsu in Japanese, or it's also known as Qicheng Zhuanhe in Chinese. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about my local narrative traditions. I don't really know if I can call it a structure per se, because we are very thin on critical analysis of Southeast Asian literature like that. But yeah, I'll just give an overview over there. So for the East Asian 4-act structure, it's not the only narrative structure of East Asia, but it's the one that I've seen shopped around the most in Western publishing at the moment. So therefore, I will only talk very briefly. You may or may not have heard of it. If you have, the information about it is the easiest to access of most narrative structures in this part of the world. So generally, as the Chinese name kind of just immediately outlines for anyone who speaks Mandarin, it's a 4-act structure, and it basically outlines a setup, a development, a turning point, and a conclusion or resolution. It's kind of been popularized as a structure without conflict, which I don't necessarily agree with. But it doesn't require conflict necessarily as certain other narrative structures would. popular examples for how this is used is basically throw a stone at any East Asian show you've ever seen. Studio Ghibli is a good example of how this tends to play out. And the sort of the key marker of it is that the characters it's usually for the learning or the skill development of characters. So there's a turning point in which they will discover something about themselves, about their world, come to an acceptance of something, after which the ending may or may not be ambiguous. There is usually not a sort of big climatic, big bad battle at the end. And that's usually where the argument of no conflict comes from. We can talk a bit more about it later. In terms of Southeast Asia is firstly an extremely diverse and large place, of which my main area of knowledge would be in Malaysia and Singapore. And for us in particular, I went and had to poke around, but it's a bit strange for works in English, as in Malaysia in particular, we don't English is one of our several main spoken languages, but it's considered a sectional literature. So it's not the national literature, because national literature is in Malay. It's one of the sectional of like Tamil, Mandarin, English, of major languages that have an impact on our history but are not national. The way this has kind of played out for us means that narrative traditions of our country has been extremely divided along religious and racial lines. And as a result, the construction of what you might consider a Malaysian narrative structure or a Malaysian narrative tradition is extremely I'd say scattered, because a lot of people would not read in certain languages but would read in another language, or because this author is of a certain like racial ethnic heritage, and therefore they would or would not be, support that author. And as a result, the way that postmodern the way that post-colonial, by which I mean is post-independence literature in Malaysia and Singapore works, is very new, very much in the process of being built. It's basically about 50 to 60 years old, not even a century yet. There's been a lot of playing on pre-colonial literatures, especially in the last couple of decades, but a lot of drawing on classical canons, but usually in a pretty superficial way. People are still articulating how they can use that. Common themes that tend to recur are social issues of poverty, gender discrimination, class, civic things. Tends to be quite hyperlocal rather than national, due to the way that the language policy has segregated all of it. So the kind of long and short of it is that there's actually still a lot of decolonization work to be done in the Anglophone literature of the country, even in a post-colonial society. I'm done.
That was great. Thank you. Fatima?
Yes. Okay. So yeah, that was actually quite brilliant. I was super into listening to that, but yeah, okay, I have to speak now. Yeah, so I've been recently going back to reading dastans, which are generally associated with an Indo-Islamic style of storytelling that has existed for quite a long time, definitely in the 13th century, and reaching a point in the 19th century in India where it was like something which was commanding a lot of attention and interest. And it's basically an oral style of storytelling, which was very much something which every court would have like this very elite dastan go or storyteller who would tell stories about which would be kind of like educational for princes and for people who wanted to engage in battle and for people who wanted to study language and etiquette. So those elements would be in those stories. And yeah, so there isn't an exact like structure, but there are 4 elements that have been identified by someone who studied them quite a lot. Shamsul Rahman Farooq is the name of the person who studied them. And those elements are razam, bazam, talism, and ayari. So razam would mean like battles and like conflict and like very high stakes warfare. And in that, the language would evoke like, the person would, the storyteller would describe the scene of the battlefield with with very poetic descriptions. So that would be very entertaining for the people listening and also educational for people who wanted to learn power moves. And the next element is bazam, which has to do with feasting, food, and describing it in great sensory detail. And like so, it's interesting because even today in fantasy settings, we really love our foods and feasts and those descriptions. So, and drinks, of course, like it's all described in great detail. Thylism means magic, so elements of magic and the fantastical. And it's like, that is like a very core feature of the Dastan. And eventually, in one of the more famous Dastans, the Hamza Nama, this like really, really took off. Thylism can also mean a parallel world, which is magical and based on magic, constructed with magic. And yeah, so that's something which really featured in the 19th century India dastans. And the last element was ayari, it means trickery. So you'd have a trickster. And this trickster wasn't the villain. They'd be the ally of the hero. So like a magical trickster who was not entirely, he was a bit morally gray, and he'd throw in his lot with the hero and be his like staunchest ally. So, when it comes to like the humorous side of the story, or like maybe if someone was engaging in flirtation, it would usually be the ayar. So he was a very popular character in these dastans. And these dastans spread like, across a huge geographical region and were very popular. So that's one of my favorite storytelling ways. And I really enjoy reading about the elements that make those up. Nowadays, because it was a verbal art, it was an oral storytelling style. It's not in vogue anymore, but I think that it has its fans, and yeah, I hope to see it more in like the written world as well. That's it. Hello? Yes.
Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Because the video keeps turning off without me doing anything. I found what you said fascinating because I was a few years ago I was reading this work called Hoshruba, The Land in the Tilisim, and that
Yes.
the word came up when you were talking about it, and I was like, oh, so that's what it means. That's so cool. Yeah. Anyway, again, Chobwe, you're up.
Okay. I grew up reading a lot of secondhand books. First of all, we grew up near the local library, so they were mainly old books, old speculative fiction books by, the library rarely got stocked. Yeah, they rarely got restocked, so we were just stuck with um a lot of old books from a lot of old writers, classic English literature. Then, new books were hard to buy, so they were expensive and they were difficult to buy. So I grew up on a diet of Western, fancy, mainly American writers. Yeah, very old stuff. Piers Anthony, Robert Jordan, Terry Goodkind, classic sword and sorcery stuff. So, but eventually, when I started to, and yeah, that was for a reason because, secondhand books usually are the kind of works that get oversaturated, that oversaturate the market. So they get resold, So it's usually not the rest stuff. It's usually not the rest stuff from minorities or marginalized people. For something to trickle down, it has to be, a lot, So basically I grew up on a diet of very Western, traditional epic fantasy, sword and sorcery, Tad Williams, and all the rest. There's usually a dragon to be slain at the end or a dark lord, So, but eventually it turned out that I write something very different because I made conscious steps to decolonize my literature, so to speak. We all started off writing, the stuff that we grew up on. You um, yeah, it's at a certain point we wrote, white characters more than we yeah. So, but there was a conscious shift at a certain point to start to represent ourselves in our stories, to have stories that have Black African characters, characters that reside where we reside, stories that are set where we live, featuring issues that, that we experience. So I realized that my narrative style, sort of had a shift even without trying to be conscious, So obviously, storytelling techniques are different, I was no longer trying to write Dark Lords, It wasn't Sauron or Saruman or the Dark One, I sort of found out that most of my stories have the environment as the big bad. There's not really any big bad. My novella Ifeyiku, Tale of Imade Yunuagbo, which was a Nebula Award finalist last year and won the Otherwise Award, is set in a place where there's nuclear war. The environment is devastated. There's mutation. Now, the biggest problem isn't even just the environment; it's how people react to the environment. There's all these new rules in place that is very restrictive and toxic to women. So
Hello?
yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Then yeah, the short story I had out last year, which is a Nebula and the Hugo and the BSFA award finalist, O2 Arena, is also set around climate change. And yeah, it's set in a world where there's toxic capitalism and there's a lot of so my point is that my stories tend to revolve around uh environmental breakdown and how people react to all those problems. So they never just happens to be any big bad, So uh yeah, and I'm guessing that I'm coming from a place where my narratives, in order for it to be true, to what I experience, which I'm trying to portray, it depends on a style that focuses on the actual issues, the actual things that I consider problems, and there are not any decisive villain or any big, bad, ugly creature which you can dispatch with a sword. So yeah, that's the style, if you can call it that, of narration that my work tends to tilt towards.
All right. And I'm gonna keep my video off now because everybody keeps conking out. Maybe that'll help things along on my end. Mia?
Ogunachoi, I really like what you said about the climate being kind of an antagonist in your work, and I'm going to put a pin in this for discussion later, or like for my own thought, like cli-fi as decolonial literature and climate fiction as an interrogation of colonial structures. Okay, so I come at this from a really different point of view because I am Taiwanese American. I was born here. I'm diaspora in that sense of the word. I am very separated from my own my people, and so I also grew up in a very Western tradition, but there are like two sides to this. So with my own favorite narrative structures, Joining mentioned the Kisho Tenketsu, but I want to I like looking at and I like listening to and reading these stories that are episodic in nature, because a lot of Chinese epic tales, just epics are episodic in nature. So think of things like Journey to the West, or even most recently, the translations of The Legend of Condor Heroes have been released. And the latest craze sweeping fan fiction, I guess, is The Untamed. And all of those stories are episodic in nature, centering a cast of characters that move from situation to situation, often without a starting conflict. Things just happen to them, and things continue happening to them, and then we have conflict. But there's like no initial conflict in many of these stories. And on the other side of that, I have begun thinking about, in my own work, what I'd like to do in the stories that I would like to tell and how to structure them. So my favorite structure here in the West is actually the two act, because of my background in music. So plays and musicals and operas will always have an intermission, which naturally breaks the story in half. Wow, I didn't talk as much as everybody else. I'll just be quiet now.
Okay. All right. Again, I talked about this a little bit earlier, so let's move on to our first question. What does it mean to decolonize story, particularly in the current SFF landscape? Or if you notice that your own narrative tradition has some non-intrinsic colonial elements, give us an example of how you'd go about decolonizing it. Fatima?
Yeah, so I'm thinking about the Dastan, and I don't feel like the content of the Dastan was ever colonized, because the Dastan goes, the storytellers themselves had, as far as I can tell, they had they were very interested in psychological freedom. And often they would incorporate elements of revolution in their Dastan, in their stories, particularly in ways which would be like kind of allegorical, not direct, because at the time, like in the 19th century in India, there was the British Raj. So like, so it wasn't the content that was being colonized, but it was the attitude towards Dastans. So if I had to say like how they were being colonized, it was like it was being considered, it was being the story that was being told was that the Dastan is a very irrational and ridiculous and full of like magic and nonsense kind of story form, and the superior form would be the novel, which was taking over, I think, in Europe around the same time. And then eventually the short story was elevated as, and those forms in where they do suffer from or they did suffer to some extent from tropes, and even today I think in English short stories in the literary realm coming out of Pakistan, and in novels, it's a constant conversation, like how to position ourselves, how to tell our stories without those influences. But the Dastan themselves, I think that there are some examples of Dastans that were very much a force against colonialism and against being colonized. It was the Dastangos themselves were aware that they would be not some they would not have the status they'd had all this time if they were to allow colonization to continue. So they've worked pretty hard against it, I think. Are we supposed to answer both questions, or just like the first part? Was it
I
an
mean,
or?
whichever the one that you feel that you want to answer.
Okay, so like I think the second part of the question was like how would we decolonize
Okay.
short stories today, right? And I would say that because it's an action, decolonizing is an action, it would
Yes.
require,
Yes.
yeah, it would require like centering and giving space, like workshops, sorry, panels like these and initiatives like these. And I think it would also require funding and money to people who are already doing the work and bring them more into the limelight. Yeah, I think I'll let other people speak now. Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, Zoining.
In terms of narrative traditions, Fatima mentioned about how writers are sort of reckoning with the colonial influence on their work, which is also something that resonates a lot with what we are doing here. The thing with this part of Southeast Asia that we're in is that even prior to the colonial times, we were essentially a hotbed of cultural exchange, just based on where we were as various trading ports, as places that received a lot of influence from South Asia, East Asia, and Africa, further parts of the world, and then assimilating and making those influences our own. So while there are indigenous narratives around, it's, at least to me, it's not so much a search for reclaiming a specific indigenous narrative, of which many of the people who currently live here and are citizens here are not indigenous ourselves, and therefore to me it doesn't quite sit right to take it from those people, as we have already taken so much else, but of making sense of what that colonial legacy is on us, especially as we continue to work in English, the medium of the colonizer, rather than any of our local languages. There's a lot of really interesting things that our writers have been doing with playing around with various Englishes. So we've got our sort of local Creole versions of English, that's Malaysian English and Singaporean English, that mixes like Hokkien and Malay and other local dialects sort of into the soup of our language. It tends to be quite quick, quite snappy, and delivered in ways that are slightly different from what you might think proper English sounds like. We've seen this, the sort of most easily available stuff you've probably seen would be in like Zen Cho's work or in Neon Yang's work. They've included this in ways that I've enjoyed quite a lot. And what other things have we done for narrative traditions? I think in terms of how we would, moving on to the second bit of your question about how to decolonize, I think the main thing would be sort of like a rejection of binary elements, because for us, one of the biggest things about colonialism is that it subdivided everybody into very specific categories and then pit those categories against each other, when even within each, like for instance, each ethnic category, like let's say Malay people, there's actually a lot of various different tribes, nations, and communities within that. But we also have got this one racial category that doesn't encompass any of that. And to be able to kind of break that and in the narrative consider how all these things might coexist with each other in a way that is not just like east versus west, or like north versus south, or like us versus them, is kind of one of the chief areas of decolonizing the story, and to look at basically the messiness of it, of that colonial legacy that has been left to us.
Okay, sorry, my camera froze up a bit. Explaining, that was a really great point. I actually stopped to write that down for a bit. Okay, Mia, your thoughts,
Been taking
please.
notes this entire time, so like I'm like scribbling like madly. So I wanted to go and address a couple of things. So how do you decolonize your fiction? And I think that takes a lot of sitting with yourself and thinking about like your natural assumptions when beginning any story, right? Cultural hegemony being one, because that is definitely a lie that the colonialists, the imperialists give us, that everybody is the same. And then think about how you're creating that world, because what colonialism does is it comes into a place, right? And it takes over and it suppresses, and it changes the economy and the politics of a place in favor of the colonizers. So for me, decolonial fiction will get rid of things like royalty, you must not suffer royals to be around anywhere. Because with royalty comes imperialism, and with imperialism comes an expansion of borders, and that is colonialism. I think we should think about the different types of colonialism. Western colonialism is very different from Chinese colonialism, for example, because we are dealing with several imperialist powers currently in the world. And Zuining and I both come from cultures that have been colonized by the Han Chinese. And so as a person who comes from a place that has been multiply colonized by the Spanish and the Dutch and the Japanese and the Chinese, and finally now only about we've only had about 60 or 70 years of being, on our own feet. It's a lot to think about, and it's a lot to sit and go back through your history and think about what influences came from where. What is truly decolonial fiction? With what was the other part of the question, Vita? I'm so sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you notice that your own narrative tradition has some non-intrinsic colonial elements, how would you go about decolonizing it?
Non-intrinsic colonial elements. This is such a hard question for me to answer because, again, the Han Chinese have such a grip on Taiwan, right? And so there are a lot of things already folded into the episodic structures of Chinese epics, like not being tension driven, or like interjections from the author or the narrator, sudden POV switches, and like random poetry just being scattered around. And those are likely holdovers from other subcultures that the Han Chinese kind of absorbed into themselves. So, like I said, it's a really tough question to answer.
All right, I should have made this clear. You can answer either or of the questions in the part, but thank you for that. That was really interesting. Again, Chokwe, what do you think?
Part of the question again.
All right. You may pick which one to answer. What does it mean to decolonize story, particularly in the current SFF landscape? Or if you notice that your own narrative tradition has some non-intrinsic colonial elements, how would you go about decolonizing it?
Okay, the second one sounds like I'll just pick the first one. Talking about decolonizing. Yeah, there's a number of things that I picked out from what Zui said. Colonialism, one of the things it does, of course, is condemn or demonize the parts of the culture that it wants to erode, then steal those elements for itself, and sort of set itself up as some kind of inventive or clever body, or whereas it's merely regurgitating what it's demonized and stolen. For example, we have the world moving towards or moving away from the binary concepts of gender, and this is considered woke. It's considered like it's enlightened, it's forward, it's progressive. But you know what? We've had this concept hundreds of years ago, before slavery. And for example, in my native language, we don't have the word for brother or sister. What we actually have a word for is sibling. So we've been gender neutral for centuries. And they will tell you, in schools, they will tell you that African languages are limited, that we don't have the word for certain things because we're not advanced enough to to understand or appreciate those things. So those things were demonized. They were considered they were considered failings in our language, and then now we find the West moving towards those things and now realizing that, perhaps it's not a failing, but it's a different, more progressive understanding of things. So, when you see scenarios or situations like that, it makes you appreciate, your culture more and all the parts of it that you might be um moving towards seeing as inferior, even if on a subconscious level. There are lots of things like that. For example, we favor the more oral form of storytelling. It's very popular. Even our documentation systems were oral, which led to lots of knowledge being lost during slavery and colonization, where a lot of people were displaced and a lot of people were killed. And there's also a lot of criticism for this kind of storytelling and documentation. People said it was inferior. Why would you store your knowledge, your bodies of knowledge with people who die off? And writing is a more, superior form of documentation and storytelling, forgetting that lots of knowledge were lost when libraries were burnt. Books, they were purges. Scientists were killed, books were burnt. So that was not exactly an infallible system either. But you know, and now we find out that the world is moving towards audiobooks. Everybody talks about how wonderful audiobooks are. You can listen to a story on the train. It's like some new kind of, like we're moving towards ebooks, then we're moving towards audiobooks now. It's like a new thing. Whereas we've had these things for centuries, and they're demonized, then eroded, then eventually they are presented back to us as something new or fascinating. So it, basically, yeah, you have to go back and look at all the things, that all the elements in your cultures that you might be subconsciously overlooking, and try to incorporate them into your work, which is going to require a conscious effort, because I mean, the effects of colonization are still buried deep in us, and we will still reach for them, subconsciously. So yeah.
I wanted to jump back in. Thank you, Oganachoe, for saying it so eloquently. I had actually written notes on this and I forgot to look at my notebook. I wanted to answer Vita's question about how we, decolonize, like in a really concrete sort of way. And this comes from my experience reading a lot of Slush and also just reading in general. For a while, we loved explorer stories. And I would love to see fewer exploration stories, because that assumes that where the person is going is an untamed or a wild land where the people there are uncivilized, and that is colonialization at work. I want to have people interrogate the necessity of religion and having a moral code, because that moral code gives us ways to act without, very black and white ways in some instances of how to act. The idea even of sovereignty and nationhood, because what's mine is mine and what's theirs is theirs, is also, in some places, a very Western idea. Borders are arbitrary. So when you write your fiction, how are you going to create that world? And then, let's see. And then ask whether in your governmental systems, is democracy the right governance for you? Especially since when we're talking about colonial fiction, oftentimes we go smaller, we go more local. And so democracy in a large scale is not necessarily the type of government that is best or even needed for your cultures and your secondary world.
Mia, that was super practical. And we do not have time to cover the other questions that I had prepared. That's because you all had such smart and eloquent answers. I want to take this time to call on the audience. If you've got any questions to ask of our panelists, now would be the time. There was one from earlier. Speaking of, what are some common tropes in your traditions that are rare in Western fiction? Uh, there are a lot. I'm sure there are, and I guess I'll have each of you say one, probably. All right, Mia.
Okay. In a lot of Chinese fiction, there is the sudden power up, and you'll see this in things like Dragon Ball Z, where a person goes from like 0 to 100 million power level, like very suddenly, and that's a hallmark of like wuxia fiction.
I did not know that. I learned something today. Joining?
The presence and involvement of everyday spirits, whom you usually have to pay respect to and don't mess around with, and are just there in your life all the time. They live their lives, you live your life, you light incense sticks to make sure that you are allowed to be in their space.
As a fellow Southeast Asian, I totally relate to that. Okay, Fatima.
I think for me, what I'm discovering while I'm reading more Dastans is that the rhythm of the world is like like time is a very different kind of concept when you're reading Dastans. It's kind of the story never actually ends. It just like moves on to the next thing. So I like that it's more cyclical, like that there's a conflict and then it ends, and then the same people wind up in a different place and they cause more conflict, and then the hero goes there. And I think that's something which I would choose as a trope.
That's fascinating. Again, Joy?
Okay, it's more about interventions from like from the, I don't know, should I say from the past, or sort of like ancestor interventions, and in Western fiction they usually also have this trope where the guy is trying to defeat the hero is trying to defeat their enemy and they can't, and then they remember some wisdom from the past that their master told them. It's yeah, we usually have ancestor interventions, which is often literal, appearances, like a spirit thing. So yeah, that's that.
Okay, cool. We have 3 minutes left, so with these 3 minutes, um, let us tell everyone where they can find you online and some last promotions. Oh, sorry, question. There was a question that came in. I think if you're in the Discord, you can ask it there because we don't have a lot of time anymore. But anyway, yes, everybody go promote yourselves. Tell us where to find you online. Zwaining?
You can find me on my website, zuiningchang.com, or on Twitter at richiewanderer, wanderer with an O, not an A.
Again, Achoe?
I'm on Twitter at Pen Prince, pen for writing, Prince _. That's it.
All right. Mia? Okay, miatside.com. And
Sorry, I was looking for my unmute. Miatsai.com, on Twitter at it's a Mia. Yes, it's a pun. And on Instagram at mia.sai.books.
excellent. And Fatima?
So I'm at fatimatakvi.com and on Twitter at Fatima Takvi. And I also have a podcast, Saying the Unsayable, and I can be found on its Twitter, say_the_unsay. So if you follow my Twitter, then my podcast will also be there.
That is a great title, just saying. All right.
Thank you.
And I am La Vie C'est Moi on Twitter. You can go to my website at vidacruz.org. You're all a great audience, and I'm sorry we didn't have enough time to cover everything we wanted to cover, and your questions too. But some of us will be on the Discord, and we can continue the conversation there. So,
All right.
wherever you are in the world, good time zone. Have a good day. Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
Bye.